If you're looking for a work that really combines the Machiavellian machinations of medieval England with some, bits of wry humor and just a whole lot to really think about and contemplate, then today's work just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing Richard III by William Shakespeare. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and today we're taking a look at one of Shakespeare's more famous histories. I would say that his histories as a whole are probably the least performed and least studied, yet I would say that there are still a few select ones that I think maybe not everyone knows, but I certainly think that if you have just an above average interest in Shakespeare, there's a chance that you have seen a performance to it or been drawn to it. And Richard III was frequently be one of those plays. It is also the last of the plays that deals with the Plantagenets. It is almost the last, chronologically speaking. There is one more about Henry VIII, which of course would deal with the Tudors, and basically all of the other plays tend to deal with the Plantagenets, and it is the fourth in the much larger tetralogy that is part of the Henry VI series. So you have the Henry VI trilogy, and then you have Richard III, which picks up where Henry VI Part 3 left off. And so you can see how they're all connected. And this is probably the last one that you feel any real connection to all of the previous plays in it, because Henry VIII does come a fair amount later than this. This is actually the second longest play in Shakespeare's canon, and for a while it was considered the longest play in the canon because the first folio actually only had an abridged version, a much shorter version of Hamlet. So if you include the full version of Hamlet, then Hamlet is longer, and then you have Richard III. For that reason, in modern performances, it actually is frequently performed in an abridged manner because of how long it is. That being said, it is a very compelling play with lots of reasons for people to perform it, and it is certainly a very complicated play, which we will get into. Let me, as usual, give you my act-by-act synopsis of what exactly is going on in Richard III. Like I said, the events of Richard III pick up where Henry VI Part 3 ended. So in Act 1, Richard of Gloucester, who is the brother of King Edward IV, is determined to seize the English crown at any cost. And of course, his scheming begins with a calculated romantic pursuit of Lady Anne, who was actually the widow of a man that Richard had himself killed previously. Remarkably, he woos Anne during the funeral procession of her father-in-law, who is the late King Henry VI, who was another one of Richard's victims, which you can read more about if you go read the Henry VI cycle, particularly the third one in this case. And despite Anne's grief and her initial resistance, she will eventually succumb to Richard's manipulations and become the Duchess of Gloucester. Richard then orchestrates the imprisonment of his elder brother Clarence in the Tower of London. Clarence, while he is imprisoned, recounts a dream of drowning to his jailer, which is of course foreshadowing his fate. Soon after, Richard hires assassins to murder Clarence, which they don't initially drown him, but they will conceal the body in a barrel of wine, which will, of course, be a reference back to that drowning. In Act 2, King Edward IV is gravely ill, so Richard assumes control as his brother's regent, and he is supported by Lord Hastings and the Duke of Buckingham. Meanwhile, three women are going to lament their misfortunes. First, there is Margaret, who is the deposed queen of Henry VI. There is Queen Elizabeth, the wife of Edward IV, and then there is the Duchess of York, Richard's own mother. Margaret curses Richard and the entire kingdom, foretelling doom. In Acts 3 and 4, we're going to see that the claims to the throne really start to foment. Richard is going to imprison his nephews, the young Prince of Wales and his brother, in the Tower of London. Buckingham aids Richard by manipulating the Lord Mayor and the citizens of London into supporting their cause. After King Edward IV dies of illness, Richard crowns himself King Richard III. Richard eliminates his rivals without mercy. He has Lord Hastings executed for opposing him and orders the young princes smothered in their sleep. Buckingham begins to question Richard's role in the murders when Richard denies Buckingham the earldom he was promised. Buckingham turns against him and attempts to raise an army. However, Richard captures and executes him. Seeking to further secure his position, Richard plots to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, and has his current wife, Anne, murdered. In Act 5, Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, emerges as a challenger to Richard's tyrannical reign, claiming the Lancastrian right to the throne. He raises an army in France and marches against Richard on the eve of the Battle of Bosworth. The ghosts of Richard's victims appear in his dreams, cursing him and offering blessings to Richmond. The battle ends with Richmond killing Richard III on Bosworth Field. Richmond is proclaimed King Henry VII, and he vows to unite the warring houses of York and Lancaster by marrying Elizabeth of York, symbolizing the union of the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster, and thus ending the famous War of the Roses. It is worth noting that this is probably a pretty inaccurate play in many respects. Richard III certainly was defeated at Bosworth Field, and the main characters' names are probably accurate. There's a fair amount of reasons to believe that someone like Shakespeare, first of all, would have been much more interested in theatrical than in accuracies, and second of all, he would have been during the time of the Tudors, of course during Queen Elizabeth, and the Tudors perceived the Plantagenet line in many regards as the antithesis, or at the very least at the end of that with Richard III, they saw the justification for the Tudors coming to power, which is who Queen Elizabeth would have been. They saw that being justified by the way Richard III acted. So he becomes the quintessential enemy in Tudor England. There's probably some justification to that, although there's also probably some exaggeration. It's kind of hard to parse out what is exaggeration and what is more accurate. The characterization of Richard being a hunchback and crippled and having all these other deformities, whether they're true or not, I don't know, but we certainly know that Shakespeare took that and ran with it, and he probably elaborated it a bit, and he certainly made it a much more defining feature of Richard than we could ever really clarify, because it made for a great villain. I will say that this play is full of some of the best liners from any of Shakespeare's history plays. You can tell by that summary that this certainly can be characterized as a tragedy as well as a history. On top of that, it just has that real element of actually an anti-hero that I think can be much more associated with the Machiavellian themes behind it. I mean, the very first line is one of Shakespeare's most famous lines when it says, "Now is the winter of our discontent." There are a fair amount of well-known openers, but I think that is probably one of the most famous ones. The real value from the lines in this play come from just those real moments of despair or moments of manipulation. Of course, Richard III is known at the end for yelling, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." In other words, at the moment in which he is about to be defeated, he is willing to give up everything simply to have a beast on which he could escape. That symbolizes just the precariousness of power. And at that moment, he was willing to give up everything for a horse, but in all reality, he gave up everything regardless. He also has some just biting one-liners that I just couldn't quite get out of my head. At one point, he says, "Dispute not with her, she is a lunatic," which is one way to shut down an argument with a woman. Not that I would recommend that, but that is one of his lines. He also says at one point, "Out of my sight, thou dost infect my eyes." Or at another point when he angrily shouts, "In thy foul throat thou liest." And these are, of course, very, very powerful lines. There are some that I think are, a little more reflective or macabre and not necessarily so much just vindictive and biting. There's one point where he says, "So wise, so young, they say, do never live long." I think it's a particularly macabre line. But I think probably the best line and quote that really embodies the entirety of the play comes when Richard says, "Conscience is but a word that cowards use, devised at first to keep the strong in awe. Our strong arms be our conscience, swords our law. March on, join bravely, let us to pell-mell, if not to heaven, then hand in hand to hell." I think that characterizes Richard's approach to power and the dynamics of this play and just all of the many things that are going on quite well, in my opinion. So who is this play for? I would say that this is one of the better known histories. That being said, it's still a history. It would certainly be in my top 5 of histories. Would it be in my top 5 of all of Shakespeare's plays? Probably not, but it would be in the top half. The fact that it's long could be a bit uninteresting to some people. The fact that it is complicated, probably more complicated than almost any of his other plays, at least in some respects. You have to have an appreciation for the War of Roses if you don't have an out-and-out complete understanding of the war roses, you certainly have to have a desire to have at least the bare bones of it. And like I said, because this is coming at the end of the three parts of Henry VI, there is an expectation that you know at least some of what's going on in those. I think that at least in the full version, you see a fair amount of references to things happening in Henry VI. All of those makes this just a slightly more complicated play, and I think that that could be really appealing to some people. I think this this anti-hero element of Richard III can certainly be appealing to some people. It is a very different type of anti-hero than what we see in Macbeth. They certainly are both still driven by the desire for power and the opportunity, and you see how it twists them. But Richard III, to be honest, is actually quite twisted from the beginning, and you can see it's incredibly calculating from the get-go. And I think that it could certainly be appealing to some people. I think that we have a fair amount of modern TV and movies to prove that that is still a compelling element of literature, and so I would say that this certainly is going to be for people that want that. It does have a fair amount of death and dying. However, not nearly as much of it is on stage necessarily as you would expect compared to some of Shakespeare's other plays. This one, there is a fair amount of discussion of battles that are happening away from the actual stage, and you do have a fair amount of people that are being killed, but most of it is being alluded to. You only have, I believe, a couple of people actually being killed on stage, Richard III being one of them. All of these could be reasons for you to be interested in this play. If you want a darker and a very theme-driven play in terms of how power can corrupt you, this is for you. Who is this not for? Well, it is long, and like I already pointed out, you have to know a fair amount of things to appreciate this play. And like I already said, it is a tragedy, so those are certainly going to be things that are going to discourage some people from reading this. Again, if you are just getting started on Shakespeare, this wouldn't be one of my first ones to recommend to you, but if you specifically are looking for histories and looking for one that has, packs a little more punch than what the public might be aware of, this would be a good one for that. But I don't think most people are doing that when they're looking for a good Shakespearean play. So this just may not be for you if you're trying to avoid a long play, a play that is just pretty dark, and a play that has a lot of complicated elements to it. Those could be things that push you away from it. But if those are not deal breakers for you, then this very much could be a great Shakespeare play for you, which I said has lots of great lines, not just one-liners, but there's a good deal of great dialogue in between characters. And like I said, Richard III himself is a fascinating character, one of the most interesting characters, I believe, in all of Shakespeare's canon, especially one of the lesser-known characters, not totally obscure, but definitely I would put him well below Hamlet or Macbeth in terms of how well people know him. But I would really like to know what you guys have to say about Richard III. Please let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.